she settled for, well, we all make mistakes. Those were the words that ended my marriage, spoken by my father-in-law Richard Blackwood as he cut his steak with theatrical precision at my wife's birthday dinner. My name is Michael Sterling, I'm 35 years old, and I run Apex Capital Management, a private equity firm that manages over $500 million in assets. But that night, sitting in Richard's granite kitchen, watching him wave his wine glass around like he was conducting an orchestra of insults, I felt anything but powerful. Richard had been calling me worthless for 3 years straight. Every family dinner, every holiday, every time I walked through his front door. Tonight was different though. Tonight he'd finally said what he really thought. Sarah sat across from me, stirring her birthday cake around her plate. She never looked up, never said a word, just kept stirring that damn cake like it held the answer to everything wrong with our marriage. Let me ask you something, Michael, Richard continued, gesturing toward my wife. What exactly do you do for a living that allows you to exist so quietly? The table went silent. Sarah's hand found mine under the table, but it wasn't supportive, it was a warning. I manage investments, Mr. Blackwood. Investments, he repeated, like the word tasted bad. You know, Harold here just closed a deal worth more than most people see in a lifetime. He pointed to his brother-in-law, the cardiac surgeon. Real achievement, measurable success. I felt Sarah's grip tighten, a warning to stay calm, to not embarrass her. My daughter published in Nature last month, Richard said. International recognition. She could have married anyone, a surgeon, a lawyer, someone with real prospects and transparent success. He paused, taking a sip of wine. Instead, she settled for, well, we all make mistakes. I looked at Sarah, really looked at her. She was staring at her plate, her face flushed with embarrassment. Not embarrassment for her father's behavior, but embarrassment for me, for being married to someone her father considered a mistake. I stood up slowly, placed my napkin on the table and looked directly at Richard. You're absolutely right, I said. She does deserve better. I kissed Sarah on the forehead, grabbed my coat, and walked out. Behind me I heard Sarah calling my name, but I didn't turn around. I had work to do. This wasn't the first time Richard's behavior had caused problems. 6 months after our wedding, I'd brought it up with Sarah during a quiet dinner at home. Your father's comments about my career are getting pretty harsh, I'd said carefully. I'd appreciate it if you could talk to him. Sarah had reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I know he can be difficult. He's just protective of me. Give him time. How much time? Let me handle it, Michael. I'll talk to him. But she never did. Every family gathering brought new insults. And Sarah's promises to handle it became as predictable as her father's attacks. After the third or fourth conversation that ended the same way, I stopped bringing it up. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe I should have drawn a harder line earlier. But I'd convinced myself that love meant patience, and that eventually, Sarah would find the courage to stand up for us. I met Sarah 5 years ago at a biotech conference in San Diego. She was presenting research on gene therapy applications. Brilliant and passionate about her work. I was there because I'd been considering investments in the medical technology sector. What I didn't expect was to fall for the presenter. Sarah knew I was successful in finance. She'd seen our comfortable lifestyle, the nice house, the lack of financial stress. What she didn't know was the full scope of Apex Capital's operations. I manage investments for high-net-worth clients. I'd told her early in our relationship, it pays well, but I prefer to keep work and personal life separate. It wasn't a lie exactly. I just didn't mention that I was both the manager and the primary client. After watching 2 college friends' marriages implode when sudden wealth changed everything, I'd learned the value of discretion. Sarah never pushed for details. She was focused on her research. And as long as we could live comfortably while she pursued her passion, she seemed content not knowing the specifics. The problem started during our first Christmas as a married couple. Richard had too much wine and began interrogating me about my work. I gave him the same vague answers I gave everyone. Private investments, portfolio management, consulting for high-net-worth individuals, all technically true, but missing the crucial detail that I controlled more wealth than Richard could imagine. But Richard interpreted my discretion as weakness. He started making comments about my mystery job and how a real man would be more transparent about his career. Sarah would change the subject, would laugh it off, but she never told him to stop, never stood up for me. The verbal attacks escalated over the following months. Richard would make snide remarks about my clothes, my car, my lack of obvious ambition. He'd compare me to other men in their social circle, successful doctors and lawyers who drove expensive cars and talked loudly about their achievements. What made it worse was watching Sarah shrink during these confrontations. The confident scientist I'd married became quiet and apologetic, constantly making excuses for her father's behavior. 3 months ago, I discovered something that changed everything. While researching potential investments, I came across Biogeneral Dynamics funding documents. The company was in serious trouble, burning through cash faster than they could raise it. Biogeneral Dynamics was Richard's pride and joy, the biotech firm he'd been running for 12 years. That under his leadership, the company had become a cautionary tale of ego-overriding expertise. They'd approached dozens of venture capital firms, but their debt-to-revenue ratio scared away most serious investors. They were hemorrhaging $2 million per month. With less than 6 months of runway left, that's when I realized I had a choice to make. I could help save Richard's company through an anonymous investment, or I could let it fail. The businessman in me saw the potential upside. Despite the risks, the son-in-law in me saw something else entirely. I started the due diligence process, keeping my identity buried behind layers of corporate structure. For 8 months, I'd been preparing a $20 million funding package that would save Biogeneral Dynamics. Richard would never know that his salvation was sitting at his dinner table. Listening to his insults, watching his daughter stay silent. The drive home from the birthday dinner gave me time to think. For months, I'd been preparing investment documents for Biogeneral Dynamics. The paperwork was ready, all it needed was my signature. I pulled into my driveway, sat in the car for 10 minutes, and made my decision. I wasn't going to sign those documents. In fact, I was going to do something much more satisfying. I was going to let Richard Blackwood learn exactly what it felt like to need someone he considered worthless. The next morning, I called my lawyer, William Martinez, and asked him to draft 3 documents: a formal withdrawal of investment interest in Biogeneral Dynamics, a notice of contract termination for the pending funding agreement, and a confidentiality release that would allow me to reveal my identity as the anonymous investor. "Are you sure about this, Michael?" William asked during our meeting. "You've spent months on the due diligence. The investment fundamentals are sound, despite the family politics." "I'm sure," I said. "Sometimes the best investment is the one you don't make." By noon, I had everything I needed. William would deliver the withdrawal notice to Biogeneral Dynamics at exactly 10 o'clock the following morning. I wanted Richard to have a full day to panic before he understood what had happened. That evening, Sarah came home around 8 p.m. She'd been staying at her sister's house since the birthday dinner, and I could tell from her posture that she'd been crying. "We need to talk," she said, settling into the chair across from me in our living room. "Okay. My dad called me today. He's worried that he went too far the other night." I almost laughed, worried he wants to apologize. "Maybe we could have dinner this weekend. Just the 3 of us. Start over." I studied her face, looking for any sign that she understood what had really happened. But Sarah was still thinking this was about hurt feelings and wounded pride. She had no idea that her father had just insulted the one person who could save his company. "Sarah," I said carefully, "how long have you been ashamed of me?" The question caught her off guard. "What? I'm not ashamed. You've never once told your father to stop insulting me." "Not once in 3 years. He doesn't mean it. He's just protective. He called me a mistake in front of your entire family." "You said nothing?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know what to say. "He gets so angry when people confront him. So you chose his comfort over my dignity." "That's not fair." But it was fair, and we both knew it. Sarah had made her choice long ago. Every time she stayed silent, every time she made excuses for his behavior, she was choosing her father over her husband. "I love you," she said, which somehow made it worse. "I know you do, but love isn't enough when you won't fight for it." She left an hour later, and I knew she wouldn't be coming back. Not really. Even if we stayed married, even if we went to counseling and worked through our problems, there would always be a part of her that saw me through her father's eyes. The next morning, I woke up early and drove to my office. At exactly 10 a.m., I called William to confirm that the withdrawal notice had been delivered to Biogeneral Dynamics. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. "Michael," Sarah's voice was shaky. "Something terrible happened. Jed's company just lost their major investor. $20 million just vanished." "I'm sorry to hear that. The lawyers won't tell him who pulled out. They said it was an anonymous investment group, but now they're claiming breach of confidentiality terms." "Jed's talking about bankruptcy." I stayed quiet, listening to her breathing on the other end of the line. "Michael, I know you work in finance. Do you think could you maybe ask around, see if anyone knows anything about this investment group?" The irony was almost too perfect. She was asking me to help find the investor who could save her father, not knowing that she was talking to him. "I'll see what I can do," I said. After I hung up, I drafted 2 text messages and scheduled them to be sent the following morning. The first would go to Sarah. The second would go to Richard. Both would arrive at exactly 10 a.m., along with a formal letter from William Martinez. By tomorrow afternoon, everyone would know exactly who they'd been dealing with. That evening, I went through the Biogeneral Dynamics files one more time. What I found confirmed everything I'd suspected about Richard Blackwood's business acumen. The company had been hemorrhaging money for 18 months, ever since a failed product launch that Richard had insisted on pushing through despite warnings from his research team. He's overruled his own scientists, convinced that his business instincts were superior to their technical expertise. The resulting disaster had cost BioGeneral their partnership with two major pharmaceutical companies and nearly $3 million in development costs. But instead of accepting responsibility, Richard had blamed the research team, fired 3 senior scientists, and started shopping for new investors to bail him out. What made it worse was that Sarah had been one of the scientists who's opposed the launch. I called her former colleague, Dr. Patricia Webb, who'd left BioGeneral around the same time as Sarah. "Samuel, can I speak freely?" Patricia asked when I explained why I was calling. "Please, Richard Blackwood is a disaster. Brilliant scientists, solid research foundation. But the man has no business running a biotech company. He treats his research staff like factory workers and makes decisions based on ego rather than data. Can you give me an example? The Neurotropin launch. We had 6 months of testing data showing the compound wasn't stable enough for clinical trials. Sarah wrote a 20-page analysis explaining exactly why it would fail. Richard ignored it, pushed the launch forward, and lost the company nearly $3 million when the DME rejected the application. What happened to Sarah after that? Richard blamed her for the failure, said she was being negative and uncommitted to the company's success, made her work environment so toxic that she had to leave. Honestly, it broke my heart. Sarah is one of the most talented researchers I've ever worked with. After I hung up, I sat in my office until nearly midnight, thinking about everything Patricia had told me. Richard hadn't just insulted me at family dinners, he's destroyed Sarah's career because she's had the courage to tell him the truth about his bad decisions. The $20 million investment I'd been preparing wasn't just going to save his company. It was going to reward him for years of arrogance and poor judgment. The next morning, I arrived at my office early and made one final review of the withdrawal documents. Everything was in order. At 9:45 am, I called Sarah. "Michael, is everything okay? I need to tell you something important, but I want you to sit down first. You're scaring me. I'm the anonymous investor who pulled out of BioGeneral Dynamics." Silence, complete silence for nearly 30 seconds. "What?" "My company, Apex Capital Management, was prepared to invest $20 million in your father's biotech firm. I withdrew the offer yesterday morning." "That's impossible. You work in portfolio management. You don't have $20 million. "Sarah, I own Apex Capital. We manage over $500 million in assets. I've been the anonymous investor your father's been courting for 8 months. I could hear her breathing fast and shallow. "This is some kind of joke. Check your phone. You're going to receive a text message in exactly 12 minutes. So is your father. The message will be from me, confirming everything I just told you." "Michael, this doesn't make sense. If you have that kind of money, why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't need you to know, and because I wanted to see how your family would treat someone they thought was beneath them. So this is what? Some kind of test to know it was going to be an investment right up until your father called me a mistake in front of your entire family and you said nothing." Sarah started crying. "I should have defended you, I know that. But Michael, this is my father's life, his company. You can't destroy it because your feelings got hurt. This isn't about my feelings, Sarah. It's about respect and consequences. Please don't do this. We can fix things. I'll talk to him. I'll make him apologize." "It's too late for apologies." At exactly 10 am, my phone buzzed with a text confirmation that both messages had been delivered. Sarah's phone buzzed at the same time. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Michael, please, I'm begging you, don't destroy my father." "I'm not destroying him, Sarah. I'm letting him face the consequences of his own choices. This is cruel. What's cruel is watching your husband get torn down for 3 years and never saying a word to stop it." Sarah hung up. 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it was Richard, and he was screaming before I even said hello. "You son of a bitch. You think this is funny? You think you can destroy my company because I hurt your feelings, Mr. Blackwood? I think you've misunderstood the situation." "I've misunderstood nothing. Sarah told me everything. You're the investor. You're the one who pulled out." "That's correct. 23 people work for me, Michael. 23 families depend on this company. You're willing to destroy all of them because I said some things you didn't like." "Actually, Mr. Blackwood, I'm willing to let your company succeed or fail based on its own merits, without my money propping it up. We had a deal. We had a preliminary agreement that I chose not to sign. No laws were broken. No contracts were violated." Richard was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller. "What do you want?" "Nothing, Mr. Blackwood. I don't want anything from you. There has to be something. Money, an apology, what?" I want you to understand what it feels like to need someone you consider worthless. I hung up and turned off my phone. It was over. 3 days later, Sarah filed for divorce. She came to the house while I was at work and packed her things, leaving only a letter on the kitchen counter. The letter was 2 pages long, but it boiled down to one simple message: she couldn't be married to someone who would deliberately hurt her family. What she didn't mention was that she'd also cut off all contact with her father. According to Patricia Webb, Sarah's confrontation with Richard had been years in the making. After our divorce was finalized, she'd driven to his office and delivered a speech that had been building up since her days as his employee. "You destroyed my marriage," she'd told him. "You destroyed my career at BioGeneral. You've spent years tearing down anyone who challenged your ego, and now you're facing the consequences of your own arrogance." When Richard tried to interrupt, tried to blame me for the company's collapse, Sarah had cut him off. "Michael was offering you $20 million to save BioGeneral," she'd said. "$20 million from the man you called a mistake for 3 years, and I sat there and let you do it. I chose your comfort over my husband's dignity, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." The conversation had ended with Sarah walking out of his office, and she hadn't spoken to him since. She'd found her voice, not in our marriage where it might have saved us, but in the aftermath, when the cost of her silence finally became clear within a week. News of BioGeneral's financial troubles had spread through the biotech community. 2 more potential investors pulled out, spooked by the company's debt ratio and the sudden departure of their lead funding source. Richard was forced to lay off 8 employees and close his secondary research facility. The local business journal ran a story about the company's struggles, focusing on the mysterious withdrawal of their primary investor. By the end of the month, Richard had put his house on the market and was liquidating his personal investments to keep the company afloat. The country club membership was gone. The vacation home in Aspen was gone. Everything was being sold to buy time. I drove past his house one afternoon and saw him in the front yard, pulling weeds from a garden that his landscaping service used to maintain. He looked older, smaller somehow, like a man who'd finally run out of other people to blame. 6 months later, I received word that BioGeneral Dynamics had declared bankruptcy. Richard had managed to find a buyer for some of their research assets, but the company itself was finished. The remaining employees were either laid off or absorbed by the acquiring firm. Richard himself had taken a job as a consultant for a larger biotech company, working out of a small office in a strip mall near the airport. The man who'd spent years lecturing me about success and achievement was now commuting to the kind of anonymous office space he's once mocked. Sarah never reached out to me directly, but I heard through mutual friends that she'd taken a position with a research institute in California. She was doing well, publishing papers and speaking at conferences again. She'd found her voice in science, even if she's never found it in our marriage. I sold the house in Denver and moved Apex Capital to Seattle, where the Pacific Northwest had a thriving tech community that offered plenty of investment opportunities. I never heard from Richard again, but I didn't need to. The business journals kept me updated on his decline, every failed venture, every missed opportunity, every time someone chose not to invest in his projects because of his reputation for poor decision-making. Richard Blackwood had learned what it meant to be dismissed, ignored, and considered worthless by people who held his future in their hands. He'd discovered that respect wasn't something you could demand or inherit. It was something you earned through how you treated others, especially when you thought they couldn't fight back. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone face the natural consequences of their own character. And sometimes the most worthless person in the room turns out to be the one with all the power. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe to check out more stories on my channel.